Now that we have seen the general structure of how any successful argument for the existence of God must be, as Aquinas says, starting from the effects of God and reasoning back to his existence, we are now in a position to examine the 5 arguments themselves. The first of these 5 arguments Aquinas calls the argument from motion, and it's this argument that is most directly rooted in the philosophical principles of Aristotle. As we may recall from Lecture 4, Aristotle set out to explain what his predecessor, Parmenides, denied, namely the reality of change. This is relevant to Aquinas' first argument for God's existence because, upon analysis, when Aquinas uses the word motion, he really means nothing more than change. Furthermore, if we remember Aristotle's teaching from Lecture 4, we'll also recall that change is nothing more than the actualization of some potential. With these things in mind, let us look at the argument set forth by Aquinas in his Summa Theologiae in his own words. Quote, "The first and most manifest way is the argument from motion. It is certain, and evident to our senses, that in the world some things are in motion. Now, whatever is in motion is put in motion by another. For nothing can be in motion except it is in potentiality to that towards which it is in motion. Whereas a thing moves inasmuch as it is in act. For motion is nothing else than the reduction of something from potentiality to actuality. But nothing can be reduced from potentiality to actuality except by something in a state of actuality. Thus, that which is actually hot, as fire, makes wood, which is potentially hot, to be actually hot, and thereby moves and changes it. Now, it is not possible that the same thing should be at once in actuality and potentiality in the same respect, but only in different respects. For what is actually hot cannot simultaneously be potentially hot, but it is simultaneously potentially cold. It is therefore impossible that in the same respect, and in the same way, a thing should be both mover and moved, that is, that it should move itself. Therefore, whatever is in motion must be put in motion by another. If that by which it is put in motion be itself put in motion, then this also must needs be put in motion by another, and that by another again. But this cannot go on to infinity, because then there would be no first mover, and consequently no other mover. Seeing that subsequent movers move only inasmuch as they are put in motion by the first mover, as the staff moves only because it is put in motion by the hand. Therefore, it is necessary to arrive at a first mover, put in motion by no other, and this everyone understands to be God." End of quote. After seeing this argument, we might do well to reflect on the fact that Aristotle's doctrine of actuality and potentiality that we saw in Lecture 4 provided a coherent description of change, but it did not provide an ultimate explanation of change, or an account of why there is change at all. That's what this argument, as well as the parallel argument in Aristotle's own writings, proposes to do. As we see from the argument itself, change is understood as, quote, "the reduction of something from potentiality to actuality." And so examples of change might be a white fence being painted red, going, that is, from potentially red to actually red, or a piece of wood that is carved into a canoe, which goes from being potentially a canoe to actually a canoe, and so on. As we can see, the argument is essentially for what Aquinas calls an unmoved mover, or otherwise an unchanged changer. And this argument rests on 2 crucial premises. The first is that nothing goes from being in a state of potentiality to actuality except by something that is already in a state of actuality. And the second premise is that the chain of movers and things moved, or changers and things changed, cannot go on to infinity. because if there were just an infinite regress of movers, there would be no first mover, no intermediate movers, and ultimately no movers or things moved today, all of which Aquinas observes is patently false. To examine this argument, let's look first at the premise that no potential is ever actualized unless by something already in a state of actuality. What does Aquinas mean by this? Take, for example, a pot of water that is boiled on a stovetop. The water goes from being cold or lukewarm to being hot. But it does so only because of something, the burner, that is already actually hot. A girl may learn to play the piano, thus going from being potentially musical, at least in this respect, to being actually musical. But she does so only by virtue of someone, her teacher, that is already actually musical, who has the musical skill and knowledge to impart. And finally, the elements of life have the potential to become a human being, but only by means of coming from two parents who are already actually human beings. And so, whether we're talking about what Aristotle called accidental change or substantial change, one could think of many examples that confirm this premise that nothing goes from potentiality to actuality except by something already actual. At this point, we might consider an important objection against Aquinas' first premise, namely that nothing goes from being in a state of potentiality to actuality except by something that's already in a state of actuality. To go back to the example of fire, one might point out that whereas fire makes the wood that it burns to become hot, it also can make that wood to become black. But fire is not itself black, and so how can Aquinas suggest that nothing goes from potentiality to actuality except by something already actual? We may be able to gather what Aquinas would say to this objection by looking back to the precise language of his argument. Notice that he never says, or even implies, that something changing from potentially X to actually X must be caused to do so by something already actually X. A man obviously need not become angry by something that is already angry. A pizza need not become round by something that is already round, and a desk need not become smooth by something that is already smooth. Looking past the example Aquinas gives involving fire, heat, and wood, his statement of the general principle he wants to establish is simply that, quote, whatever is in motion must be put in motion by another. In other words, whatever goes from potentiality to actuality does so by virtue of something already in a state of actuality. It need not be in the specific state of actuality in which the thing that changes ends up. In short, therefore, Aquinas is saying nothing more than that every change that occurs must have some explanation in the world of actual things. A man does not get angry for no reason, even if he doesn't have a good reason. A pizza doesn't become round with nothing actual to make it round. And a desk does not become smooth without something or someone to make it smooth. Change necessarily requires an explanation, and that explanation must be some kind of cause, something that causes the change to occur. But what about the premise of Aquinas' argument that this chain of movers, or this chain of changers and things changed, cannot go back to infinity? A skeptical reader of this argument is, of course, simply tempted to ask, why not? What's stopping the chain of movers and things moved just from going back forever? What makes matters even more confusing is the fact that elsewhere, Aquinas explicitly argues that, outside of faith, human reason cannot determine whether or not creation came into existence at a definite point in the finite past. So if Aquinas believes that the question of whether the universe had a temporal beginning is just inscrutable, how can he say here that the chain of movers and things moved, something presumably inherent to the created universe, cannot go back to infinity? One might well ask, Why can't the universe just have no beginning at all? Why must there be a first mover? What's interesting here is that St. Thomas is not actually saying that the universe must have had a beginning. Admittedly, this is what he appears to be saying. But, as I just mentioned, it is well known among scholars of St. Thomas that he actually thought the question as to whether the universe had a beginning is just not one that philosophy can solve. Of course, the Christian faith teaches that the universe came into existence by God a finite time ago. But St. Thomas is adamant that this teaching, like that of the Trinity, is only knowable because it has been divinely revealed. So why does he now say that, quote, inefficient causes, it's impossible to go back to infinity? It may help to begin answering this question with an analogy. Suppose you and your friend Mike are standing beside a mountain next to which exists a set of railroad tracks, turning the corner and disappearing behind that mountain. Imagine also that on the tracks there is a train, the back end of which you and Mike both see, but the front of which is on the other side of the mountain, and therefore not visible. Noticing the train is moving in the direction of the mountain, you ask Mike, "What's pulling the last car on that train?" Mike responds that the car in front of it is clearly doing the pulling, and thus causing the last car to move. "But what's pulling that car?" you respond, pointing to the second to last car. Mike responds by pointing to the third to last car. "But what's pulling that car?" "Well, the one in front of it." "And what about that car?" "Well, the one in front of it." And the conversation goes like that for some time. Eventually, in frustration, you ask Mike, "Okay, I get it, but what's causing the whole train to move?" It would surely be strange if Mike only responded that what lies behind the mountain is just an infinite series of cars. Somehow that response would be terribly unsatisfying, not just because it's extremely unlikely, but because it doesn't really answer the question. It doesn't really, in other words, explain the motion of the cars that you and Mike see. It doesn't point to where the motion might actually be coming from, because the cars themselves are not the kinds of things capable of generating that motion. To keep going along with the analogy, the only satisfying response would be that there exists at least one car that's not being moved by any of the others, something like a locomotive. At the very least, you and Mike must admit something moving the train other than the kinds of cars you see. Even to say that the train is being pulled by a giant dragon would be more adequate than simply appealing to an infinite series of cars. At least it would be an explanation, albeit an extremely unlikely one. What St. Thomas is saying about the necessity of a first mover is something similar. It's not so much that an infinite series of movers and things moved is impossible. It's rather that an infinite series of movers, even if there is such a series, does not provide the explanation required, any more than an infinite series of boxcars explains the motion of the train. Even an infinite series would still need to be explained by some first cause or some first unmoved mover. Likewise, the existence of the universe requires an unmoved mover even on the assumption that the universe is beginningless. In response to the question as to why the universe is in motion or subject to constant change, it's no answer at all just to say that the universe is infinitely old. Even if it is infinitely old, that motion and change we perceive still demands an explanation other than itself. We'll understand Aquinas' first argument for the existence of God even better if we consider a third objection. Even granted, someone might say that there must exist a first mover, why must we call that thing God? Isn't the God in which religious people believe so much more than just a first mover? Is not that being also omniscient, omnipotent, perfectly good, not to mention personal, that is, hearing our prayers, forgiving our sins, and intervening in human history? The answer to this question is, of course, yes. But Aquinas would argue that these observations do not in any way diminish his argument as an argument for the existence of God. The reason for this is that, quite obviously, those who already believe in God by religious faith will recognize the first mover as identical with the being in which they already believe. Consider for a moment the implications of proving the existence of a first mover. If motion is nothing other than change, or in Aquinas' words, the reduction of some potentiality to actuality, then the first mover cannot admit of potentiality whatsoever. In other words, the first mover as first will be pure actuality, and therefore not subject to change. But this means it cannot be material or physical, since all things material are subject to change. Another implication is that the first mover cannot come into existence or go out of existence, since that too would be a kind of change. So at the very least, Aquinas has proven the existence of an immaterial and eternal cause of change or motion. And so it's hardly a valid criticism of that to complain that this very same argument does not also demonstrate that this being is creative or personal or omniscient. There are other arguments for those things, some of which, as we will see, are implicit in Aquinas' other four arguments for the existence of God that we'll examine in the lectures to come.